So I wrote a thing a while back. It's actually still in my sandbox. I'm on sandbox 2, and you can dig it up if you want. There's a few tabs in there. But it's titled Bad Skip Bingo. And it briefly existed in our guide hub before it was pulled for being too mean. It really wasn't the intent. The thing is, handling deletions these days, I see about 100 skips a week and delete about 90 of them, and I'm not exaggerating those numbers. Uh, so this has been the state of things since I wrote this, probably 5 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, somewhere in there. Uh, I wrote this Bad Skip Bingo, and it's done in the format of a bingo card and includes a free square in the center and then 24 uh, tropes and problems that were ubiquitous to the time. And I gotta tell you, most of them are still ubiquitous problems. Bad Skip Bingo has actually survived the test of time better than I ever thought it would. So I'm gonna just kind of run through these things that I included on the bingo card, and I'll just read it top to bottom, left to right. So starting from the top left, we have Rage State. And this was a bigger thing when I wrote this, which was mid-series 2. Everything had a rage state. And in that rage state, it became much more powerful and could do all sorts of terrible shit at will. Those still exist. I still see those skips with rage states, but not to the extent that I saw them back then. Below that, I have a magical item that I'd roll greed on. We have basically done a good job of migrating a lot of that stuff to the log of anomalous items and keeping people in the habit of doing that. That's actually a pretty popular log still. The next one I have down says appears to be and is. And to elaborate on that, it is a very common phrase that gets used in the descriptions. And it's that SCP blah blah appears to be a coat rack. And we never have anything that indicates that it's not a coat rack. It actually is a coat rack. So it appears to be, and it actually is. So there's, unless you are following up, it appears to be blank. However, it's actually blank. Don't use appears to be. Say that it is. If for all intents and purposes it is that thing, then stick with that. Appears to be will make the longtime readers roll their eyes. Below that, I have watermarked image. And since the intervening time between then and now, the images team has gotten to be a lot more diligent in how we catch these things, how we handle skips as they're being posted. Watermarked images were very common once upon a time, and we've actually done a great job of eliminating that. That's probably the only one on here that I would say has been almost completely eliminated over the years. And finally, rounding out the B column, I have Keter Duty. This card was written at the peak of that foundation. They're so crazy. Any minor transgressions would subject you to Keter Duty. We've kind of moved on. The LOL Foundation canon, it doesn't get a lot of love these days. And it was a fun time at that point, but we've pretty well moved on, and we'd honestly moved on even, into just going into series 2. It's like, all right, we've got 1,000 of these things that, will subject people to Keter Duty. Let's maybe move on. In the I column in bingo, we start with roam site freely. And to give you a hint of how ubiquitous this was and remains to be, this was one of the 5 categories that we chose for ClichéCon for story elements. This is not how the Foundation operates anymore. The odds of posting something, well, I won't say odds. What I'll say is anytime you invoke a trope like this, anytime you elect to use something of this sort that's been just beaten into the ground, you do so at your peril. It will immediately put you in a hole. There are a couple of things that will just so actively work against you should you include them. You're better off not including them at all and just having nothing in its place. And that's one of them, roaming the site freely. Below that, I have that's not what memetic is. We are still not great in distinguishing between memetic and compulsive and cognitohazardous. And I get it. That's it's not something that you come across in your day-to-day, but we do have the guides that explain the differences between them. Below that, I have cross-tested with famous SCPs. We're done. We've been doing that. And this is another one of those things like roam site freely that actively works against you and actually works against you far more than merely roaming the site freely. Cross-testing with something like 682, 173, 096, 105, man, it takes... I don't know what you would have to do at this point to successfully pull it off. It would probably work in the form of a joke article. Should the rest of it really stand up to scrutiny, it might work if you are really... God, I don't even know. The more you raise the stakes in terms of your narrative, including those famous skips, it's like you've got to have a hell of a story to bother even attempting it. And I can't recall the last time I saw one where I didn't go, oh geez, not this again. Moving on, we have Crazy to Death. This was another one of the Cliche Con categories, and my first piece, 1388, was a Crazy to Death piece, and it is what it is. At this point, we see right through it when it gets posted. And the fact of the matter is, the reader base nowadays is much more sophisticated than it was 6 years ago when I posted 1388. It will not suffice to simply have a cool item or to have something that kills indiscriminately. We've seen it so very much that we're actually desensitized to it, and the readership demands more from you. You're not going to get away with Crazy to Death without something more compelling backing it up. And rounding out we have Incomplete Entry. See those darn near every day. Summary deletions are tracked in the deletion log under announcements. It's amazing how many people will throw stuff up that and not cold posts. That's a different sort of thing. I'm talking incomplete entries. They wrote the item number and maybe to the object class and a little bit of the description, and then said, "Yep, looks good. I'll come back to this later." Not gonna fly. We will process a summary deletion on it, and we may or may not even notify you that we deleted your work. Going into the N column, we have measurement in American. This is very common still. Do not... I've actually come to think of it, that might be something that if it hasn't been done as a joke article, maybe it could, where it must be all of the units are in Imperial or American units, however, whatever you want to call them, because referring to it in metric would cause containment breaches. Outside of, that very specific use case, you want to use the metric system, always. And if not the metric system, SI units. There's an SI unit for just about anything you could imagine, and for the things that don't have SI units that deal in anomalous stuff, we've probably already got a unit of measurement for it. It's worth asking around, but it will almost never be feet and inches, pounds, yards, miles. Anything like that is going to be a quick downvote from a lot of people. Below that, I have no vote module. This is still common, and even though we, tell you exactly what the code looks like they still get missed, and I think everybody's missed it at some point, but people do catch it, and nowadays they'll throw that vote module on there almost immediately because there are just so many eyes on the newly created pages section that you're not going to get away without a vote module for very long. I have a free square below that says free square, he innocent. And below that, we have the Shark Punching Center, a Shark Punching Center item. SPC may have been more common then than now. I don't see a lot of SPC items get posted these days. God, it felt like every other one that got posted when I wrote this thing said SPC 1508 or whatever. And below that, I have redacted, redaction packed, data expunged. This is, it's less than it used to be. It's still not where it needs to be. People are still in the habit, particularly our new writers that are used to working in Series 1 and reading the Series 1 skips, all the famous ones. They might read 15 or 20 of them and say, okay, that's cool, the black boxes, the redactions, the expungements, but they don't really get what the practical effect of it is. We use these things to increase the intrigue of an item sometimes. Sometimes it's to remove things that aren't all that relevant. And sometimes they get conflated where we redact things that actually are very important to the work to stay up, or sometimes things are redacted that it wouldn't matter at all in universe whether or not it was redacted. It is something that we've got guides devoted to. Zen and the Art of Data Expunged is the long-standing one. It's very much worth your time. If you're not sure when to use what, it will help you on your way. But probably the biggest offender there is using expungements or redactions so you don't have to come up with what's behind it. It's, unless it just absolutely doesn't matter what was behind it, then that's not the way to go. If nobody else knows or can piece together what's behind something, you, the writer, at least need to know. And that's my soapbox as it pertains to redactions. Going into the G column, I have a Guy What Fights Good. And I wrote this on the back of Able and how popular Able was. And, this was a much more common thing at the time. I don't see a lot of them these days. I do see the bad self-inserts that, and I have gratuitous self-insert also in this G column. But I've seen it both ways. Sometimes, usually they're combined, in all honesty. We have a self-insert, wearing a hoodie, maybe a backpack, and he can also kill people with his mind and fire lasers out of his tits and, whatever. It goes back to that point I was making earlier. If the narrative behind it isn't compelling, nobody will care how good he is at fighting. It will be downvoted to deletion threshold in a matter of hours. Below that, I have My Little SCP, Titanium is Magic. I still see a lot of Titanium in skips that are headed for deletion. It's not as bad as it was, but like some of these others, still has room for improvement. And this ties directly into the cell right below it that says overly specific containment cell. So I'm going to combine them here. We see a lot of unit must be, if it's a humanoid, let's say, needs to be stored in a 5 meter by 5 meter by 5 meter containment cell made of titanium. So there's two questions that need to be asked there. One, why in hell does the thing need a 5 meter tall ceiling? Is it actually directly affecting the ability of us to contain it to keep it in a cell that size? What happens if it's 4 by 4 by 4? What happens if it's 6 by 6 by 6? What happens if the walls aren't made of titanium? What if they're just made of frickin' plywood or drywall or whatever? I get that people will include those, those strong materials like titanium or telekill, which actually didn't make it into Bad Skip Bingo, believe it or not. But they will add these things to sort of raise the stakes early. That he's got to break through it. But if it doesn't matter that the thing's made of titanium or not, and only matters that the cell needs to withstand a certain amount of force, then say that it needs to withstand, a high amount of force. And if it doesn't matter how tall the ceiling is, and it just needs to be something you would consider to be about the right size for a prisoner of some sort, you can include more generic units. You can say, let's say a standard psionic human containment cell. That is plenty. You can let the reader imagine what size the cell is, and you can let them imagine what sort of precautions the Foundation has taken to make the thing appropriately resistant to a psionic human. Doesn't matter what it's made of, and it actively takes away from the rest of the work when you include needless details. If you're not, it's like the Chekhov's gun. If you're gonna bring up titanium, you really had better be prepared to explain why it must be made out of titanium. Below those two, I have a very badly misspelled spell checker class, Elucid. I still see a surprising amount of poor spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And it's been so persistent over the years that we've told people, hey, there are websites and things where you can take your work and it'll not only check your spelling, but your grammar too. We didn't really have that. Actually, when I wrote this, Grammarly didn't exist. We tell people, take it back out of the sandbox, put it in Word, and let Word rip your article to shreds, and then you can bring it back in your sandbox. Below that, we have gratuitous self-insert. These are still fairly common, and they really don't live very long. The self-inserts of old were, these famous author avatars of Clef, Bright, Gears, Kondraki, Crow, Iceberg. Those, sort of founding fathers, they got to get away with it. But we've got 160,000 subscribers on RSCP. It's sad but true. You don't get to get away with it anymore. It's just the way it goes sometimes. Moving on to the final column, I have redacted containment procedures. I mentioned that a little bit earlier in the redaction packed data expunged. And it is the cardinal sin. Do not redact your containment procedures. The procedures are how we know how to keep the thing contained. If you redact stuff from it, we can't contain it. So don't do it. The next row I have says compels you to use it. I will admit, if you read 1388, I combined compels you to use it with crazy to death. That was a killer combination for a long time. And honestly, you can still do it, but you need a little more to the story than just the combination of it compels you to use it and makes you crazy to death. But neither mechanic by itself is necessarily a showstopper, but it is one of those things where the bar is set so high that at any more you can't just rely on those two. Going down from there, I have quantum defibrillator detects bad science. And what's interesting, I think over the years, we've actually relaxed a little bit as it pertains to bad science. And I feel like it was a bigger sin back then that we had a lot of subject matter experts absolutely waiting in the wings to tear you a new one for missing something or other that should have been in the article, or you screwed up a unit in particle physics, or theoretical, quantum, whatever the hell. We had subject matter experts for all that stuff and absolutely ready to jump down your throat for getting any of it wrong. And don't get me wrong. I think having the proper science in a work, if you can do it at all, please do it. I think it adds a ton to the immersion. Anytime I end up drafting a skip or getting into the weeds on writing something, I find myself going down the Wikipedia rabbit hole, just trying to find the right units of measurement and then figuring out what the extremes are. I have another one in my sandbox on, I needed to figure out what sort of units, if we have containment cells at a foundation site, what are the sort of things that we would want to potentially have as variable controls in the cell? And I said, well, probably temperature and gravity and pressure and what's something really esoteric? Let's do entropy. And so I figured out there's some, doing some calculations on, all right, so how much, if we did variable temperature, let's say that the foundation could control it anywhere from just a hair over absolute zero to, let's say something that if you were building a site and you've got materials on hand, what's something that we could safely get up to in a temperature? And I chose something just a couple of degrees below the melting point of titanium. And said that was my upper limit. But getting into things like entropy, I had to go so far down a rabbit hole just to figure out what the units are for, entropy and chaos. And turns out they all exist. And not only do they exist, there are reasonably sourced numbers that you can look at for baseline amounts of it. So if you are considering posting something, you're not certain of the science, the bad science will still bite you in the ass. It is still very much worth your time to get more eyes on it. And even if it's just asking around, hey, are there any chemistry experts around? Normally people like to show off their skills, and they will gladly help you out if you can bring them a very specific question on, does this check out? Does this make sense? Normally you're going to get the help you need at that point. Below that, I have seriously bad tone, you guys. Bad tone is still a showstopper. It is probably the most common reason for deletion of them all, that the tone does not meet our standards. The tone is, if anything could define the wiki, to me, it is the tone. That when you have this very terse, dry, scientific universe and your writing doesn't reflect that, it is immediately, it's a slap in the face. It is, it pulls everybody out, and the downvoting is almost inevitable. And, it's probably the most difficult thing to nail on the site is the tone. It requires, really, college level education, essentially, to get it from reasonably, passable tone to polished, exemplary of what the wiki can do level tone. Yeah. I mean, you're talking college grad, post grad level writing. And that was part of what attracted me to the place, is just the bar being set so high and it being so, challenging to rise to meet that standard. And I really appreciated that about it then. And even in the years since, we have been very, we guard that tone as it pertains to the main list. Tails and GOI formats and so on, of course, have their place, but on the main list, the need for polished, precise tone is as pivotal as it ever was. And finally, rounding out Bad Skip Bingo, I have bad dialogue. Bad dialogue is what it is. It won't sync your skip because it is fairly ubiquitous, but it's definitely something that when you combine it with enough of these other things, and that is the point of Bad Skip Bingo, that bad dialogue will, take a skip from great to good or from good to okay very easily. And the easiest way to, have an idea of where to go with your dialogue is to speak it. It sounds simple, but I guarantee you people are not, they're not vocalizing their dialogue as they're writing it. They, you'll, and you can read it later and it's immediately clear that they never spoke these sentences aloud. You trip over your tongue trying to, get them out, or they just don't sound like anything that person would say. Bad dialogue has been around forever, probably will still be around forever, but that does not excuse you from making those minimal efforts to improving it. Get people to look over just your dialogue, and if you get that feedback, have people help you out with it. Even if it's where potentially you have sort of a script that you want to get through, workshop that with somebody. Have them respond. You can kind of let them know what you're going for and let them respond naturally. Record it, write it down. That is as easy a way to go as any. Now, the way that I had this bingo card set up is below all of it. I said, so you wrote a bad skip, and worry not, we've all done it. And it asks how many bingos you got on the card, which would be, 5 connected entries here. And if there was one bingo, it said, congratulations, you have some homework now. And I link Aolana's Common SCP Pitfalls, the big list of overdone SCP cliches, and the collaborative rules of thumb. I'm not sure if all these guides exist anymore. I had one for 2 bingos, and it said read everything above, and then cliches and you, Zen and the Art of Data Expunged, and doing the safety dance. And take this advice, writing an SCP is not a race. Nobody here will remember the day your SCP hit the list, probably not even you. It's better for it to delay posting it until it's something you're proud of. I want to hammer that home because I fell victim to that myself. When I got here, I was like, I gotta get on this. I gotta, make my mark. And the trouble with that is if you don't really know what you're doing, if you haven't taken in that wide variety of articles and have, your own really compelling idea and, built it up with a good foundation of where you are and where you're going, this is not a sprint. It is a marathon, and you will have, very prolific authors and people that can, sit down and knock the whole thing out in a day. And I want to make sure you're aware that is the exception. That is not the rule. For the most part, the works that are on the wiki are the efforts of a lot of writing, a lot of drafting and feedback, and that feedback loop improves the work. And jumping in and trying to write something just to make your mark without having the foundational understanding will more often than not result in deletion. If you have 3 or more bingos, I told you to read the entire Guide Hub, all of it, including the history of the Korean wiki. And if you had no bingos and still had your article deleted, I mentioned that I left off some common reasons for downvoting, the biggest being meh, or it was well written but not interesting. And I point out that we have a drafts forum and several channels, and one of these channels doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. And lastly, I had no bingos, but if this card was shuffled, I'd have like 5 of them. And I told you to consider yourself somewhere between 2 and 3 and read accordingly. I just stumbled upon this thing while I was misclicking looking for something else. Thought I'd share it with you. I'm actually trying to test some new microphone equipment that I have today. Very curious to know what you guys think of it. Still trying to dial it in, but hopefully this sounds a little bit better. But I want to know your thoughts either way. So hopefully this was an interesting little sidelight into things that I've seen and things that I've, years back I tried to advise against, and sometime in a few of these cases we've gotten better, and honestly in most of them we're about the same or even a little worse than back in the day. So hope it was interesting. The recap for week 2, we'll try that again, will be, I'm aiming for Friday. I'm aiming for 6 or 7 skips to cover for the week. Still have more ClichéCon to run through and the usual log of entries. I'm going to try to cover more of the Tales and GOI formats as well. It's been the, single biggest request from the community at large is to cover this other work, and that makes sense given that the sort of reader that's so interested in the Foundation that they're consuming this sort of alternative media, these podcasts and the other things, they love the Foundation in all of its forms, and the SCPs are one part of it for sure. And for the average reader, it's the only thing on the site, but the Tales and GOI formats make up nearly half the website by count. So probably not fair of me to not give them their moment in the sun. The trouble with it, of course, is that effectively doubles my reading time on this. So still trying to figure out the balance here. So bear with me. I appreciate those of you that have been listening and giving feedback, and to the writers that have taken my critique or review of the skip, as it were, and incorporated the changes. I'm humbled. I do hope that this helps the readers, the writers, the ambitious writers that haven't put anything up there yet. And this little bad skip bingo sidelight, hopefully it explains a little bit about the pitfalls that we've seen, because I saw these 6 years ago. I still see them now. And there's no reason at this point to not make use of all of the resources that we have available to improve your work, and to be aware of the pitfalls at this point. I highly suggest making use of the Guide Hub, making use of the draft forums, making use of the fan-run communities, making use of all the places that we've set up, because we want to see the wiki thrive, and the only way it thrives is through a combination of the growth of the site and the writing of good skips. So, there's nothing keeping you from jumping in. Hopefully, one way or another, it becomes an interesting, constructive experience for you. And, with any luck and a little patience and a little practice and a lot of feedback and critique, we end up with something that benefits us too, because you've given us something that we can really enjoy. So until the week 2 recap, this is Blue Soul for SCP Cafe. We will see you on Friday.